Tower blocks are, and always have been, a controversial subject. They were devised out of necessity. Following the Second World War, there was an urgent need for new housing thanks to bombing. The aim was to avoid the mistakes of the past, the slum dwellings of earlier generations, but in so doing, a whole lot of new mistakes were made. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the Ronan Point disaster. Ronan Point in Canning Town, East London, was a block of flats built in 1968 as part of an extensive programme of house building by Newham Council. The block was built by Taylor Woodrow Anglian for just £500,000, which even in 1968 money was pretty good going for 110 flats. How did they build them so cheap? Well, the key was in the construction method. The block was constructed from prefabricated concrete panels in what's known as the Nielsen-Larsen method. In this method, the panels would be slotted together, then bolted and cemented at the joints. Prefabrication had become fashionable since the war as a quick and inexpensive way of supplying the large amounts of housing required. The resulting buildings tended to be architecturally uninspiring, but needs must when the devil drives, as they say. Cost-cutting wasn't just evident in the building methods, as the unfortunate residents discovered just before 6 a.m. on the 16th of May 1968. Resident Ivy Hodge, a 56-year-old cake decorator, lit a match to light her gas stove and was surprised by an explosion that blew her across the room and took out the load-bearing walls. This caused a domino effect, with the 4 flats above collapsing. Their weight, in turn, caused the ones below to collapse, resulting in the destruction of the entire southeastern corner of the building. Residents were evacuated via the stairs, the lifts having stopped working. Local dockers joined forces with the emergency service to clear debris and aid in the rescue operation. Volunteers set up a station for providing food and clothing to those afflicted. 3 people were killed in the disaster, with 17 injured. There were some narrow escapes. One woman was stuck on a ledge as the rest of her sitting room vanished. Things might have been a lot worse. The block was only a couple of months old, and many of the flats were unoccupied. Ivy Hodge, who had unwittingly triggered the disaster, was among the survivors. So too, astonishingly, was her gas stove. And this raised an important question. How had a woman, at the very epicentre of the accident, survived relatively unscathed while the building she stood in had been wrecked? As you would hope, an investigation was carried out, led by Hugh Griffiths, QC. What was found was not encouraging. The explosion had blown the load-bearing concrete panels out of their slots. The problem lay in the joints. It transpired that corners had been cut, rather more literally than usual. Substandard bolts held the walls in place, and incredibly, many of the joints that should have been cemented had instead been stuffed with newspaper or just left unreinforced. Weight distribution between the panels was also poor, placing uneven stress on the load-bearing walls. Newham Council and the Ministry of Housing were both criticised for an overly lax attitude to building regulations, and it was found that the engineer in charge of construction was inexperienced. The regulations themselves were also found to be at fault. For instance, the building only had to withstand winds of 60 miles per hour, whilst winds of 100, though rare, are far from unknown in Britain. All in all, it seemed that even if Ivy hadn't tried to light her gas stove that morning, some kind of disaster was inevitable, and probably worse than the collapse they actually had. Rebuilding works were carried out, but understandably the former residents were in no hurry to return. Only 2 residents, a retired couple, were actually willing to move back in, with the rest demanding to be rehoused. One tenant interviewed by the BBC commented, "I wouldn't live there rent-free." In 1984 it was decided that Ronan Point had to go, and so it was demolished in 1986. As it was taken apart, piece by piece, cracks were found in the concrete. It's been speculated that it might not have survived the Great Storm in 1987. The rebuilt site is absolutely unrecognisable today. You'd never know that a tower block had been there, let alone that it had been the site of a disaster. The Ronan Point disaster was simply the result of shoddy workmanship and poor oversight, but it did have some positive effects. The building regulations were tightened up to ensure the safety of future blocks in the event of accidents. Tower blocks fell out of fashion partly as a result of this disaster and partly because of the social issues they'd brought, with many being subsequently demolished. This was far from the last disaster to befall a tower block in London. The Lakenall House fire in 2009 would kill 6, and the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017 would result in a death toll of 72. In both cases, the structures were found to be in breach of regulations, and the local authorities were heavily censured. It seems that as long as there is neglect from those in charge, the cost will always be paid in human life.